Hello, everybody. Hi, this is Jackie Lukeman, and I am broadcasting live from Washington, D.C. Hey, friends, how y'all doing? I hope you are ready for this discussion today. This is part 3 of the discussion we've been having about Fidel Castro and his legacy. Tonight's the last night of the discussion. We've covered a lot of ground, and I haven't even been able to tell you everything there is, but I hope that the links that I provided on the previous 2 live streams have helped you out some. And forgive me for looking down like this because I have some new bifocals and I'm getting used to them. Hi, Lana. Hi, Michelle. For those of you who are signing on, my name is Jackie Lukeman, and this is Real Progressives, and we are talking about Fidel Castro. This is the 3rd part in my discussion that I'm having with you about Fidel Castro, his legacy, the legacy of Cuba, and U.S. involvement in Cuban policy, and how the United States has influenced how we see Fidel Castro in this country. Hi, Rona. How are you? So, last night, we left off at around the end of 1961, when the United States, under President Robert Kennedy, had approved basically this covert, not so covert anymore, program to use Cuban exiles. The CIA, he approved the CIA to train Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The United States actually started trying to kill Castro less than a year, probably 4 or 5 months into his rule of Cuba. And it wasn't because of communism, like I said last night, because the United States knew that Cuba and his rebel forces were in the mountains in Cuba for several years before they overthrew Batista. They knew about Castro and his brother. They knew that they had some communist leanings then. So the idea that the United States was terrified of a communist regime in Cuba was really not true. The United States had a problem with the fact that in less than 6 months, when Fidel Castro overthrew the murderous Batista government. Remember, I said that the United States sent the Batista regime, which was a dictatorship, arms, and helped Fulgencio Batista murder 20,000 Cubans over his 7-year reign. All right. Hey, Chanel, I'm so glad that you're here so that I can explain it to you some. All right. Hey, John, good day to you. Hi, Arino. I think it was somebody further up who said that it was JFK and not RFK. Actually, Robert Kennedy was involved. Robert Kennedy was the one who basically created the program that used the CIA to train Cuban exiles to invade and overthrow and try to kill Fidel Castro. So they were both involved because remember, Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General in his brother's administration. And Robert Kennedy was the one who said that destroying Fidel Castro, overthrowing him, getting rid of him was his highest priority above all else. So yes, Robert Kennedy was involved too. Okay, so now today, hey Jesse, hey Paul, aho Jesse. So today we're at 1962. And I'm not going to go through every year because, look, there's a lot. Fidel Castro was 90 years old when he died. I'm not going through his entire legacy. But there is one thing that I want to start off with that we have to clear up tonight and today for some of you who are much farther away than on the East Coast. I want to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis because let me just say at the outset, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the way it is explained to us here in the United States, is a blatant lie. Just a lie. In regard to who started it. All right, but let me get there. So in 1962, in February, President Kennedy bans all trade with Cuba with the exception of medical materials and food. He says that there's to be no import into the United States of goods that are even made with Cuban materials. So this means that any country in the world that traded with Cuba for anything that they use to create anything, the United States wouldn't even buy those products from other countries because they were made with Cuban goods. Do you understand what that does to an economy? Cuba is an agrarian society. It's wealthy in land, and that's pretty much it. The land is amazing for growing food and different things. Hi, Wendy. I'm glad you caught me live. But other than that, Cuba really doesn't have any natural resources other than the amazing soil. It doesn't have minerals. It doesn't have oil. It has to import everything from other countries. So imagine what it does to an economy when the wealthiest nation in the world says, we're not going to buy anything from anyone in the world that uses anything from Cuba to make anything. And we're not going to trade directly with Cuba either. We're not going to buy their sugar. We're not going to buy their tobacco products. We're not going to buy their rum. 3 things that Cuba was extremely famous for. As a matter of fact, Cuban cigars are still highly sought after and still illegal to possess by American citizens. Don't ask me how I know that. But the interesting thing about President Kennedy's trade embargo against Cuba was that he implemented this trade embargo after he ordered 1,200 Cuban cigars for his personal use. And listen, we all look back on presidential legacies after the fact and we do analyze them more closely and you know we're more critical of them than we were when they were alive. That's just kind of natural. We all do that because we're not privy to all of the information at the time, especially not during this time in the 60s when there was no internet and people weren't passing around articles about what President Kennedy was actually doing. But it's really interesting to see this level of hypocriticalness. Is that a word? I just used it, so it's a word. It's interesting to see this kind of hypocritical behavior from a president who is so beloved by so many people. But what we don't realize is that John and Robert F. Kennedy had what even some of their advisors believed was an irrational hypocrisy. Thank you. I'm hungry, so I can't remember my words right. Thank you. Thank you, Irino. Hypocrisy. Thank you. But even some of the Kennedy cabinet members criticized that Kennedy's hatred of Castro was almost irrational. That his fear of this great communist regime that was 90 miles off the coast of America was just, and that it would somehow cause some type of harm to this country was they didn't even understand it. And the Cuban Missile Crisis is really the manifestation of that unreasonable fear that existed in the Kennedy administration, because what we are told about the Cuban Missile Crisis is that because Castro was a communist, he got into a deal with the Russians to put nuclear missiles in Cuba so that the Russians could target the United States and kill us all quickly with their massive nuclear weapons. And that's the story that we were told. The problem is that's actually half true. That's actually not even half true. It's probably a quarter true. Because what really happened was in 1961, The United States, under President Kennedy, installed nuclear weapons on the border of Russia in Turkey. We also installed nuclear weapons in Italy for the sole purpose of carrying out a first strike against Russia, because at the time, one of the prevailing attitudes in the American government's military plans was that if we hit them first, they can't hit back. So when American planes fly over Cuba in September of 1962, and they see missile silos on the island, American nuclear missiles had already been in Turkey, pointed at Russia, for almost a year. The Russians knew this, and the Russians saw American missiles installed in Turkey as an act of provocation against them by the United States. That is why Russia made a deal with Castro to put nuclear weapons in Cuba. It wasn't because the Russians were trying to kill us first. It was because the American government provoked the Russians to do it. Here's another fact about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which really wasn't a Cuban Missile Crisis. It was really an American missile crisis. Here's another fact about this crisis that a lot of people don't know. The American planes saw the missile silos in Cuba on October 16th in 1962. President John F. Kennedy didn't actually make an address to the American people about this horrible, horrible, frightening crisis until October 22nd. Now, if it was such a crisis, now I understand you don't want people to panic, right? I understand that you don't want people to freak out and you don't want people looting in the streets and, losing all hope and burning stuff down. Okay, fine. But if it's such a crisis, how do you wait that many days to alert the American people that the Russians are about to kill us? That doesn't make sense. And it doesn't make sense because the actual reason for Russians putting nuclear missiles in Cuba has always been obscured, ignored, lied about by the American government. What they had to do was come up with a way to sell the fact that we were about to do something illegal to Cuba in response to Russia doing something that was perfectly legal under international law. Because the Cuban government approved missiles being installed in Cuba, Russia didn't violate any international law. They didn't violate any international treaty. And again, they responded to United States provocation from the missiles being installed in Turkey, right on the border of Russia. What the United States did next was illegal. The blockade of Cuba was illegal. That was an act of war. And had Nikita Khrushchev been the psychotic, despotic, communist madman that we have painted him out to be, he had every right to push the button and destroy us all. But he didn't. Thanks, Liza, for sharing our video. Thank you very much. And the 8 others of you who have done that. But he didn't. So for all this time, all these lies were told about the Cuban Missile Crisis, that Fidel Castro was in league with the Russians to destroy the United States. And that's why there were nuclear weapons from Russia on the island of Cuba. No, the Russians were defending themselves against what they saw as American aggression. Now, I bring this up because I'm not gonna go into the long history of you know, the documents that were declassified and released that proved that the United States started this mess. And it was Kennedy who got this world to the brink of nuclear war. I'm definitely gonna put links to the article from The Atlantic. It's an amazing, amazing piece on the Cuban Missile Crisis and what really happened and how close we really came to nuclear annihilation. But I bring this up to make this point. If our government would lie to us all this time about that very, very important point in American and Cuban history and relations, do you really think they're telling you the truth about who Fidel Castro really was? Especially since if you look at what's going on in other countries, especially African countries and Latin American countries, you have leaders of these countries, people in these countries. Hey, Mary, you're not late, you're here. That's great. You have leaders and people in these countries who are mourning Fidel Castro, who are honoring this man's legacy. Are all of those people blind, ignorant, and stupid of who Castro is? Or is it us? Let me tell you a little bit of why Fidel Castro is honored in Latin American and African countries to this day, and why in this country many Pan-Africanist and Black Power organizations revere him. It's because this guy, who is the leader of a little country that's like 90 miles off the coast of Florida, that's that big, has done more to help African people and Latinos and Latin Americans fight against imperialistic Western oppression than any other country in the world, just about. Robert, I am telling the truth about the man's legacy that most people here in the United States know nothing about because our government and our media doesn't tell the truth about him. One of those truths is that Fidel Castro sent troops to Angola to help the Angolan people fight against a South African government that was trying to invade and take over Angola. Fidel Castro did that. That's a great point, Catherine. Why does the mainstream media not show celebrations of his... Oh, why do they show celebrations of his death? Well, that's what I'm talking about, because they've been lying to us about who he is for years. And in part 2 of the video of my live stream series, I explain why some people in this country who are Cuban exiles and the children of Cuban exiles celebrate his death. There's a reason behind that. But Fidel Castro sent Cuban troops to the African nation of Angola to stop the South African government from invading and taking over Angola and spreading apartheid, not once, but twice. The South African government tried to invade Angola in October of 1975. Fidel Castro sent troops to Angola and helped the popular movement for the liberation of Angola fight for their independence then, and again in 1988. And in 88, Castro convinced the Soviet Union to provide arms to the MPLA to fight against the South African-backed and very confusing named National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, otherwise known as UNITA. UNITA was not an organization that was of the Angolan people, for the Angolan people, or by the Angolan people. UNITA was an organization that was backed not only by the South African apartheid government, but it was also backed by the United States government. Robert, what I am not doing is making excuses for any of the things that Castro did that were horrible. What I am doing is providing a balanced view of his legacy, especially in light of the fact that the person, the dictator, the murderer that he overthrew killed 20,000 Cubans over a 7-year period with the help of the United States government. So, yes, Fidel Castro did kill some people in his reign as a dictator. Many of those people were enemies of the Castro government, of the Castro revolution. Many of those people were pro-Batista people. Not all of them. Many of them were. But here's an interesting tidbit, and I need to go back to the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because one of the conditions for the Cuban Missile Crisis being resolved was that the United States demanded of Fidel Castro that he release the Cuban exiles who were involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Now, if Fidel Castro was a murderous monster, why didn't he kill every single one of the 1,200 Cuban exiles that the CIA trained to invade Cuba and kill him? He didn't. He imprisoned most of them. And when the United States negotiated with Russia and Cuba for Russia to take missiles out of Cuba, the United States secretly agreed to remove the missiles from Turkey. We never admitted publicly that that's the reason the Russians did what they did. And Fidel Castro agreed to release the Cuban exiles who were involved in the Bay of Pigs invasion. Again, I'm not saying Fidel Castro didn't kill some people. There is not, honestly, and let me burst some of you all's bubble right now. I don't believe there is a leader of a nation on this planet who has not been involved in the unfair killing of some people somewhere that somebody doesn't like. I am not at all saying that Fidel Castro was a saint. I am not at all saying that he was perfect. What I am saying is that we've been lied to about not only much of his legacy, but much of the involvement of the United States government in creating the conditions that Cubans have to deal with to this day. And much of what has gone on when we talk about Fidel Castro's legacy has not been completely conveyed to us. That's what I'm saying. So I am absolutely sorry that your family was a victim of Castro's violence. I'm not dismissing that at all. So aside from sending troops to Angola, because you see, the fact that Castro did these other things doesn't take away from the horrible things that he did, but the horrible things that he did do not take away from the good things that he did either. If that's true, if that's our standard, then explain to me why it is we have so much faith in our public officials. If the bad deeds of our leaders invalidates anything good they have done, explain to me why we still have so much reverence for Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter or Bill Clinton or Barack Obama for that matter, because every single one of them have been involved in killing people, not only abroad, but in this country. So let's not be naive about who our world leaders are. None of them are perfect. None of them are saints. But I am here to tell you the truth about the legacy of Fidel Castro and what that legacy means to revolutionaries around the world. So Fidel Castro, pretty much the only leader in the world that sent troops to stop the South African government from expanding into another African nation. Why is that important? Because if the South African government had been able to take over Angola, they would have spread to much of the rest of the continent. And like I said, the United States government supported the South African government's efforts. Also, Cuba, under Castro, was one of the only countries to almost immediately support the African National Congress in South Africa. And I am reading this from a couple of websites, so yes, I'm going to give you these links too. I am. He was one of the first leaders in the world to immediately recognize and support the right of Black South Africans to fight for their own freedom. This was at a time when our own government was calling Black South Africans terrorists, even as they were peacefully protesting against the South African apartheid government, and children were protesting and being killed by South African authorities because they didn't want to be forced to learn the white South African language of Afrikaans in their schools. Cuba provided amnesty to Joanne Chesimard, otherwise known as Assata Shakur. Now, Assata Shakur is a very controversial figure to some people because, like I keep saying, the truth is not told about her. She was accused of killing a New Jersey state trooper in 1973. She was convicted under highly questionable procedures in 1979. Her trial should have been thrown out. It should have been a mistrial. And forensic evidence that was collected later actually exonerated her, proved that she did not shoot this man. But people in the United States are still convinced that she murdered New Jersey State Police Officer Werner Forster. She did not. Fidel Castro, seeing the struggle of Black Americans fighting against our own government, seeing the unfairness of the trial against Assata Shakur, seeing that the American system of jurisprudence wasn't fair, he gave her asylum. That's one of the reasons he is such a hero among Black nationalists and Black power groups in America today. Castro supported Black American businesses. The second time he visited the United States, because remember I said last night, the first time he visited was a month after he overthrew Batista. No, Assata Shakur, not Angela Davis, Chanel, although Angela Davis has visited Cuba. The second time Castro visited the United States, no, that's okay. This is all very complicated stuff. That's why I have notes and websites. It's okay. The second time he visited the United States, he was going to stay in Midtown Manhattan, but they didn't want him there. So he thought, well, where would I go? He went to Harlem. And he stayed at the Hotel Teresa because he said, when the New Yorkers kicked me out of a hotel in Midtown, where else could I go other than amongst my friends in Harlem? And that's where he went. And he insisted, he did. That's right, Sandra. The Teresa Hotel is a Black-owned hotel in Harlem. So when he stayed here in the United States, in New York, he stayed at the Teresa Hotel, a Black-owned hotel. He ate at Black-owned restaurants. He talked to Black leaders in Harlem. And then he took the plight of African Americans fighting against racism in this country to the United Nations. Let's see. Let me go down here. It wasn't just African nations and rebellions or revolutions in African nations and African Americans that Castro supported. He also supported revolutions in Latin America. He supported Venezuela against sanctions from the United States. Even after he stepped down as what did he call himself? Prime Minister or whatever it was, because people also don't know that Castro didn't actually rule in Cuba the entire time. He stepped down. He actually stepped down because he was sick and he was old. Yes, he did give the reins of power to his brother, which is very problematic. But even outside of his control of the government, Cuba, under his ideology, supported any government that stood up against Western imperialism and colonialism. Here's something that even black people don't know. I actually didn't know this until I had started doing research for this. This is really amazing to me. Cuba offers free medical school to black people from America. I'll give you the link. In 2000, Castro announced that Cuba would provide free medical training to hundreds of low-income Americans. The late Reverend Lucius Walker, former executive director of the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, the New York-based group that facilitates the program stateside, said Castro's scholarship offer wouldn't be necessary if American medical schools opened their doors wider to disadvantaged minorities. Why is that important? Because, as I said earlier in this stream, Cuba is famous for its sugar, it's famous for its tobacco, its cigars, famous for its rum. But Cuba's number one export, the number one export from Cuba to this day is doctors. Because Cuba has socialized education. It is free to every Cuban citizen. And Cuban medicine and Cuban doctors are highly regarded all around the world. Why? Because Castro sent Cuban doctors everywhere in the world, just about, where there was a medical crisis and a need for doctors. Exactly, Dion. I had never heard about it until I did the research for that. The Ebola crisis? Castro sent doctors there before we did. It's true. Cuban doctors and Cuban medicine is one of the leading reasons that the Ebola crisis was stemmed in Africa. Hurricane Katrina, I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but Fidel Castro offered to send 1,500 doctors to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The United States government didn't even respond to his offer. Didn't even respond. Acted like he never said anything. Cuba also sent troops to fight against the U.S. invasion of Grenada. Remember that? I was in high school. Cuban soldiers were deployed in Grenada during the invasion of the tiny Caribbean island by U.S. troops. In 1983, the Cuban government sent troops there to support the Black Power and socialist-inspired government ran by Maurice Bishop, leader of the New Jewel movement, which brought about improvements to Grenada's social and economic infrastructure. The U.S. felt threatened by this movement of black self-determination and moved to overthrow the New Jewel movement in Grenada. I hope you're seeing a pattern here. Every time black people, whether it be in Africa, brown people in Latin America, black people here in the United States, have decided to come together, organize, and fight for our rights, the United States government has opposed us. Every time. My husband, who is a bigger history buff than me, tells me the story of when I think it was Italian immigrants to the United States wanted to go fight against Mussolini. The United States government allowed them to go. But when black people wanted to go fight for Ethiopia, for their independence, the United States refused to allow us to go. This kind of relationship has always existed with black and brown people in the United States government. As a matter of fact, It's existed with other governments around the world because Russia wasn't too happy that Castro was supporting Latin American revolutionaries either. And they decided at one point to take their financial support away from Cuba because of Castro's support of Latin American revolutionaries. So you've got the United States government, the most powerful and wealthiest government in the world, refusing to do trade with Cuba because of this so-called communist threat. That wasn't it. And then you've got Russia, the country that was supposed to help Cuba, taking away its financial support because they don't like that Fidel Castro is helping Latin Americans. Are you surprised that there were bread lines in Cuba? How can that be surprising to you? But see, when the bread lines happened, our media didn't explain all of the other stuff that America had done to Cuba and that Russia had done to Cuba. All they said was, look at the bread lines in Cuba. This is the result of socialism and communism. This is why we hate it. This is why we oppose and hate Fidel Castro, because we don't want this kind of thing to happen in our country. This is why I'm having this discussion. Because that is the truth about the legacy of Fidel Castro and Cuba. Yes, the totalitarian rule. He controlled Cuba for too long. He was a little paranoid, but he sort of had a right to be, because people have been trying to kill him. People, meaning the United States government, has been trying to kill him since 6 months after he overthrew the man who orchestrated the murder of 20,000 Cubans. And the CIA has tried to kill Fidel Castro in the most ridiculous and costly ways, but he outlived them all. My husband frequently says, and I absolutely agree with him and understand what he's saying, you can't rule a country for 40 years by fear alone. You have to give the people something to keep the people from rising up against you. And Castro actually did that. He wasn't good all of the time. Yes, there were some serious problems. There were absolutely some atrocities. There were some people who were murdered. Yes. There's no but behind that. There's no, well, you understand, you see. No, there's no explaining that. That's horrendous. While that is true, so is everything I am telling you tonight. So while we in the United States look at Fidel Castro as this evil puppet of the Soviet regime and a willing participant in the plans of Russia to spread communism to the United States, please understand that we've been lied to. Not only about many of the good things that Fidel Castro did, and again, the good things don't erase the horrible things he did, but the horrible things don't erase the good things he did either. And I actually talked about 500 people he killed. But understand why this man is so important and his legacy is so important, not just to African American fringe black power groups here in the United States, but to Africans and Latin Americans around the world who are mourning his death and honoring him today. These are images you're not going to see on American media. Because organizing poor and oppressed people, organizing youth groups, and reaching out to the military and convincing them that, you know what, you're being used. You should be a part of this revolution. You should be fighting on behalf of the people. That's the model that Castro and Che Guevara cemented in the mountains of Sierra Maestra before they overthrew the Batista government. That's what lives on of the Castro legacy. That's what people celebrate. The people of Cuba are mourning their great, dear, beloved leader today. We should not, absolutely should not dishonor what they know of him simply because our view of him is biased and very one-sided. So I hope I've done a halfway decent job in giving you some information that you didn't have before about Cuba, about Fidel Castro, about the United States government's involvement, tampering in that little tiny island nation. And I hope you do some more of your own research. I will throw the links up for all of my sources. And I really appreciate you guys watching and sharing this video. Well, thank you, Rosalie. Thanks so much. Again, not saying that Castro should be anybody's hero. It's not my job to tell you who your heroes should be. I do hope that I've provided a little bit more of a balanced view of not just Castro, but of our own government. And I hope this view of our government helps you realize what we are fighting against, why we're fighting against it, and understand that we have to fight against it. So, share this video, you all. Please join us on our YouTube channel and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are Real Progressives on YouTube. Check out our website, realprogressivesusa.com. Check out my and my husband's personal thing, Coffee, Current Events, and Politics in Luke Mon Nation. If we ever run our own nation, you know it's going to be fierce. But absolutely stay tuned for more live streams. Oh, check out our Patreon page. I keep forgetting to do that, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to. Check out our Patreon page, y'all. If you like the content we provide, if you like the information you get from us, please consider being a patron of Real Progressives, because the things that we want to do in the future, can't do them for free. And we don't want to take money from big old corporations. We certainly don't want to take money from shady political candidates. We want to provide people content that they feel is important to them. So we want to be funded by you. We want you to have buy-in on this effort that we are trying to undertake for the future. So please go to our Patreon site. I'm going to put that link up there too, and consider becoming a patron of Real Progressives. Thank you all very much for watching and sharing our videos. Stay tuned. I'm sure somebody is going to be live streaming again later on. This is Jacqueline Luke Mon, broadcasting live from Washington, D.C. in the United States of America. Thanking you very, very much for watching and wishing you a very wonderful night. Peace.